As it is Pride Month, I initially thought it would be nice to do a celebration of LGBTQ plus characters in Doctor Who or something along those lines. However, the trouble with that is when you get down to it, LGBT representation in Doctor Who hasn't actually been all that great, especially in the current era, which got me thinking about whether celebration is really appropriate right now. Given how diversity and inclusivity seem to have been at the forefront of the marketing for the most recent series, it's ironic really that probably the best example of LGBTQ plus representation actually comes from the Moffat era. What's great about Bill Potts is that she's a fully fleshed out character in her own right, and although her sexuality is explicitly brought up and shown enough times that you can't just ignore it or pretend it's not there, it doesn't define her either. She's not a good character because she's gay, it's just one superficial trait that she happens to have, and that's awesome. None of this is to say the social ramifications and wider issues surrounding Bill's sexuality are not explored, and I particularly like how Moffat examines the more subtle forms of homophobia that come with a heteronormative culture, such as how Bill's foster mum changes her reaction and automatically assumes her date must just be a friend because she's female. There's no deliberate or blatant homophobia going on here, just an assumption. But that assumption and its associated implication that there's something wrong with you if you do not conform to said expectation, I would imagine is a big part of the reason why coming out remains such a challenge for so many. It's not necessarily all about the hatred and harassment you may encounter in public spaces or on the internet, although that is a large part of it for many people I imagine, but it's also about what will my conservative parents think? How are my friends who use homosexuality as a punchline going to react? Now, while all of this is great, the character of Bill that is, not the subtle homophobia, it's still only one character, and since the Chibnall era began, the show has really taken a step backwards as far as LGBT representation in the main cast goes. Sure, there have been hints here and there about Yaz's sexuality, but nothing open and explicit like with Bill. And all of this is before we've even started on the sorry state of trans representation in the show, or should I say the lack of it. I strongly recommend watching Cynical Who's video for a more comprehensive overview of transgender representation in Doctor Who, which I'll put the link for up on screen now, but I warn you it's not a pretty sight. There is a throwaway line that implies Cassandra may be trans in Series 1, but it's honestly more charitable to say that it is just a throwaway line and nothing more, since there are so many problematic transgender stereotypes attached to her character, like her obsession with surgery, which she is repeatedly ridiculed and chastised for by our main characters. Other than that, discounting spin-off media, there really hasn't been any meaningful attempt whatsoever to represent transgender folk in any capacity, and when you consider the show has made trans people the butt of jokes, continues to reference J.K. Rowling, cast its first ever trans actor in the role of a literal mindless grunt, and former show staff have come out as being openly transphobic, Doctor Who no longer looks so much like the beacon of inclusiveness it purports itself to be. Now, of course, there is a strong argument to be made that the main character herself, the Doctor, is now coded as either being trans or gender fluid, but this is never explicitly spelled out as a stated intention of the writers, and while coding and subtext may have served its function in days gone by, you no longer get points for doing that. Unless it's made explicitly clear, then it's not good enough, and that goes for all the Thasmin baiting as well. Now, I've no doubt there are some who will think I'm being unreasonable by holding LGBTQ plus representation to such high standards, and there are times where I've gone back and forth, for instance on whether I was too harsh on the Owl House when we reviewed Enchanting Gromfright. I do appreciate that Lumity is something of a watershed moment as far as Disney higher-ups allowing that kind of representation in one of their shows, but the way I see it, we wouldn't celebrate and get all excited if it was a straight character who had a crush in a kids' TV show, so why should we be celebrating because it's a gay character? As someone whose demographic happens to be well represented in media, at least in terms of gender and sexuality, I certainly don't see it as my place to be rejoicing just because a marginalised group got thrown a bone. And that's all it is at the end of the day. There's nothing whatsoever remarkable or special about Amity or Bill Potts, at least not when you go by the same standards as what straight cis people like myself have already been used to for decades. It's just the bare minimum. Proper representation should be the norm, not the exception, and so if you're going to put diverse diversity and inclusion at the forefront of your marketing, then you'd better be prepared to do more than the bare minimum. Merely having the occasional gay supporting character who doesn't immediately get killed is not enough. A trend which I've increasingly been observing over the last month is big corporations jumping on the Pride bandwagon for PR, superficially pledging their allegiance to the LGBT community. Call it virtue signalling if you like, which is all well and good, but I think with this in mind, now more than ever it needs to be stated out loud that merely claiming to have those virtues does not mean you get to congratulate yourself or call yourself an ally. It's what you do to back that sentiment up that actually counts, and right now Doctor Who could be doing a lot more. I'm Midnight, and I just lost my train of thought.